Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Charles David Keeling Lecture. I'm Jeff Trapp, head of the Department of Atmospheric Sciences here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Now, before our speaker is introduced, I'd like to give you just a little background about the Keeling Lecture. This event is named for Charles David Keeling, a 1948 University of Illinois graduate from the Department of Chemistry, who determined how to make extremely precise measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide. These measurements clearly indicated that the atmospheric CO2 concentrations were and still are increasing, leading to the recognition that human activities could have a significant impact on the Earth's climate system. After receiving his PhD in chemistry from Northwestern in 1954, Keeling spent most of his career at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography until his death in 2005. As the first to confirm the accumulation of atmospheric CO2, he produced a data set now known widely as the Keeling Curve, and his measurements are renowned as the single most important environmental data set taken in the 20th century. Each year, a collaboration between academic units on campus results in a lecture on climate to honor Keeling's legacy. This year's lecture is co-sponsored by the Department of Atmospheric Sciences and the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. And our lecturer is Alice Hill. So here's Professor Don Wobbles to continue with the introduction. Don?
Thanks, Jeff. So hello, everyone. It's my honor to do this for several reasons. First of all, I, as a co-developer of the Keeling Lecture, I'm really happy to participate in it once again. But secondly, to be able to introduce Alice Hill is really special to me. Okay. Alice is a very special person to me from our time together at the White House 5 years ago, well, 4+ years ago, where we interacted on climate issues. At that time, she served as special assistant to President Obama and senior director for Brazilian policy on the National Security Council, where she led the development of national policy to build resilience to catastrophic risks, including climate change and biological threats. And it was for that reason we met many times during that time period. Currently, she is the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, Alice is I was introduced to her 5 years ago as Judge Alice Hill because of her previous experience as a judge. More recently, she's been putting a lot of effort into looking at climate resilience. A couple of years ago, she actually published a book, which I happen to have. I don't know if you can all see that. That was on building a resilient tomorrow. It's an excellent book. And she has a new book coming out in a few months, I assume, called The Fight for Climate After COVID-19. So I could go on and on about Alice, but I'd rather listen to her speak. So Alice, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Jeff and you, Don, for inviting me to join you tonight. It truly is a humbling thing to be giving a lecture in Charles David Keeling's name. So thank you for this opportunity. One of the fun things for me was really to try to understand what Dr. Keeling's contribution to climate science had been, since I came to climate science, as Don has said, rather late in my life. I'd already had a prior career. And certainly Dr. Keeling's 5 decades spent investigating atmospheric carbon dioxide brought to light for the world the challenge that has begun to shape human existence, how the planet operates, and will continue to shape it for decades to come. Dr. Keeling was a person I admired not only for his science, but he was a big outdoors person. And soon after he got that PhD and moved to Scripps in San Diego, he started making trips to Big Sur State Park to start measuring the atmospheric accumulation of greenhouse gas emissions. And over time, he soon started building the facility at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, which is at over 11,000 feet, 2 miles above sea level, to really track this for the country and for the world. And he quickly detected that the accumulations were exceeding what had been occurring in the 19th century and growing. And that data collection has, as you've heard from Jeff, resulted in what is widely known as the Keeling Curve. It's even engraved, that curve is engraved on a building at the Mauna Loa Observatory, where measurements are still taken today. And it's carved, I didn't know this, but I just learned, into a wall at the National Academy of Science building in Washington, D.C., which is just a few blocks from my office in pandemic, pre and post-pandemic times. I haven't been there lately, but his work has marked everything. And we have learned so much. When he started in 1958, the parts per million was 315 parts per million, up from an estimated concentration of 280 parts per million during the pre-industrial era. And of course, as carbon emissions continue to accumulate, they form this kind of blanket around the globe that retains heat, which brings these impacts that Don and others and I were working on. How does the United States, how does the globe address the growing risks, physical risks from climate change? Sea level rise, greater heat extremes, more severe drought, bigger storms and greater precipitation, where that rainfall just falls all at once in what emergency managers sometimes term as rain bombs. But it took 3 decades for Keeling's groundbreaking work to really enter into national policy discussion in a significant way. So from that 1958 start at Mauna Loa, it took to a sweltering day in June 1988 for a NOAA scientist, Jim Hansen, to testify before Congress that he was 99% that record temperature increases resulted from this growing concentration of greenhouse gases rather than natural variation. And by then, Mauna Loa was measuring atmospheric levels of carbon at 353 parts per million. And two decades after Jim Hansen's testimony, my phone rang. In 2008, as you've heard from Don, I was a judge on the Los Angeles Superior Court and a former white-collar crime prosecutor. Barack Obama had just been elected as US president, and on the other end of the phone was Janet Napolitano, a friend of mine from law school. We'd gone to school together. And she was asking, how would you like to come to Washington? That moment yielded one of the most important pieces of career advice I can share. Be nice to those you sit next to in school. You never know where they're headed. President Obama had recruited Napolitano to become Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, the third largest agency in the federal government after the Departments of Defense and Veterans Affairs. Now, of course, DHS had been born out of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, in the largest reorganization of government since the creation of the Department of Defense after World War II. In addition to its deep anti-terrorism focus, DHS shoulders broad security responsibilities across its close to 24 agencies. It has emergency management, FEMA, as immigration enforcement, as we're seeing at the borders right now, as the immigrants are coming from Central America. It also has protection of American waterways by the US Coast Guard. And not long after I arrived at DHS, President Obama issued one of his first executive orders on climate change. That was in October 2009. It required all federal agencies to find ways to cut their carbon emissions, but also for the first time to plan for the impacts of climate change. By the time I received that climate assignment, Mauna Loa scientists had detected carbon concentrations of 384 parts per million. But like so many Americans today still, despite Dr. Keeling's invaluable contribution to global understanding of the threats posed by the accumulation of fossil fuel emissions in the atmosphere, I didn't at that time appreciate the dangers of climate change. I had had no formal education about the issue. Whatever I knew came from media accounts. In fact, honestly, I thought it was something for the distant future and maybe had something to do with saving polar bears. I was not sophisticated at all on the topic. But to respond to Obama's order, I needed to take action. And just an aside on how I got that assignment, given that I don't have a climate background and I had a legal career before, is that climate change was still a polarizing issue at that time. It's still now. And many within the department did not view working on climate change as a career enhancer. And frankly, as I recall it, we're sitting around a conference table and everyone's leaning back. The body language is they aren't interested in taking on this assignment. And somebody says essentially, oh, give it to her, she's new. And that's how I started working on climate change. I assembled a task force. Fortunately, we have, as Don knows, some of the top scientists in the world working on climate in the federal government, at least we did at that time. So we assembled a task force that could first answer a very basic question, and one that in retrospect seemed somewhat insubordinate to the president's order. But until that question had a solid answer, I knew it would be difficult to garner any enthusiasm for planning for climate change. People were skeptical. There were plenty of deniers about the reality of climate change. So we asked ourselves, should the Department of Homeland Security in 2009, with all of its other responsibilities, care about the impacts of climate change? And we heard from these dozens of scientists, planners, and security experts, people from the Navy, from NASA, from NOAA. And based on the evidence presented, the task force unanimously got to the same answer. DHS should care deeply about climate change. It would affect virtually all of the department's missions. Indeed, it affects all systems, both human-made and natural. Now, in addition to working on climate change, Secretary Napolitano also had me working on biological threats. I was the head of the DHS leadership group on biological threats, and that can include direct terrorist attacks, for example, using aerosolized anthrax, to a chemical spill, to a pandemic. DHS had responsibility for coordinating federal efforts with those of state, local, and tribal governments in preparing for and responding to these types of biological threats. And it was because of this work, in my later time on the National Security Council, working with Don and others, and as Senior Director for Resilience Policy, that I realized that climate change and pandemics bear deep similarities. Now, 2020 gave everyone a chance to compare and contrast these catastrophic risks of pandemics and climate change. It certainly has shown us why managing catastrophic risks matters, why it matters to plan in advance and be better prepared. In March 2020, the coronavirus began its deathly gallop from Wuhan, China, across the globe, bringing the world the worst disaster in living memory, and a pandemic that's invaded virtually every corner of the earth. Hotels have gone begging, whole industries have gone into a tailspin, companies reversed course. Eventually, we're all told to stay home, work from our kitchen tables, and with jobs being lost in droves, Worldwide hunger spiked, as did domestic violence, suicide, and child marriage. And meanwhile, governments pumped out trillions of dollars in stimulus packages to support their struggling economies and populations. We even got new vocabulary related to the disease: lockdown, social distancing, super spreader, COVID-19. But it wasn't just the worldwide pandemic that caused 2020 to be like no other year. In 2020, climate change, once considered this threat for the distant future, arrived firmly in the present with a vengeance. The effect of all those accumulated emissions that Dr. Keeling had found the way to measure cut their own swath of destruction across the planet. The strongest cyclone ever to make landfall hit the Philippines, carrying record-sustaining speeds of 195 miles per hour. And by the way, as I'm giving this lecture, the Philippines is facing its earliest super cyclone in the season ever, clocking winds of 190 miles per hour. Last year, the Atlantic hurricane season carried so many named storms that meteorologists had to turn to the Greek alphabet to come up with new names. And in the Horn of Africa, 200 billion locusts flew in voracious swarms, 20 times the size of the city of Paris, devouring 50 to 80% of crops in the field. That's an estimated 8,000 more locusts than would appear in the absence of climate change, and the equivalent of 25 for every person on the planet. Temperatures soared to likely the average highest recorded in the Arctic Circle, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, as well as the highest ever recorded on Earth, 130 degrees Fahrenheit in the aptly named Death Valley in California. And historic wildfires consumed so much land in the western United States, over 10 million acres, that we had to come up with a new word, a gigafire, to describe 1 million acres being burned in a single fire. Of course, we had the brush fires in Australia, killing an estimated 3 billion animals, and zombie fires smoldering through the long Arctic winter in Siberia. So this string of record-breaking events also carried a record-breaking invoice for damages. According to the global reinsurance company Munich Re, the economic losses from natural disasters jumped from 166 billion in 2019 to 210 billion in 2020. And for those of us who tend to think that the United States is exceptional, we're certainly exceptional in the term of damages we suffered last year. Of that 210 billion, estimated 95 billion were caused in the United States. Both climate change and the pandemic are when, not if, problems. Both carry deep uncertainty as to their precise timing and scope, but really not as to whether they will happen. Success in combating these two risks requires public support and political leadership. And of course, fighting pandemics and climate change requires use of science to inform decision-making. And that's why we're so lucky to have the very fine scientists we have in the United States, like Don. Both of these risks are borderless disasters. By that, I mean that they will not honor these jurisdictional boundaries that we've so carefully crafted over the centuries. Humans just have placed borders around all these locations, but pandemics and climate change impacts just sweep right across those. And because they cross borders freely, efforts to address the threats must cross borders as well. Communities and nations must work together to reduce risk. With both pandemics and climate change, it's the most vulnerable among us, people with disabilities, women and girls, older people, and the marginalized, and those that have suffered historical discrimination, that pay the highest price. Any programs to counter these threats must account for these disproportionate impacts. Once either of these threats, pandemics or climate change, materialize, they undermine critical systems, including finance, public health, transportation, communications, and national and human security. They are threat multipliers, increasing vulnerability to horrors like economic impoverishment and criminal mayhem. As the pandemic revealed, failed or weak or sluggish responses by governments in the immediate aftermath of disasters provides inroads for bad actors to use humanitarian aid to recruit members and expand territory. Rebels in Yemen told young prospects that it's better to die a martyr in heroic battles than dying at home from the coronavirus. El Chapo, the head of one of the largest cartels in the United States, now in prison, but his daughters delivered hand sanitizers and other pandemic supplies in boxes stamped with his picture to communities in need. And perhaps most important of all, greater preparation and early action can buffer the damage from these threats. For both climate change and pandemic, Ben Franklin definitely has it right. An ounce of prevention will yield a pound of cure. 2020 carries a warning. We need to prepare for these growing catastrophic risks. As we are seeing increasingly across the globe, in an interconnected world, catastrophic risk can bring communities, cities, and even nations to their knees. They have the capacity, these risks, earthquakes, pandemics, climate change, you name it, have the capacity to cause widespread damage. Earthquakes and pandemics have plagued the entire arc of human history. An earthquake in China in 1556 is believed to be the deadliest in history. It's estimated to have killed 830,000 people. In the 14th century, the Black Death killed a third of the world's population. In 1918, 50 million lost their lives in the Spanish flu pandemic. And in the past, communities have also experienced catastrophic events of the type that we can expect from climate change and that will be worsened by climate change. For example, when the Yangtze River in China flooded in 1931, 2 million people died from drowning and a lack of food. And similarly, big storms of the past have caused big losses. In 1971, Hurricane Bola struck what is now Bangladesh. The storm cost 500,000 people their lives. So as a result of hundreds and some thousands of years of experience with catastrophic risks, humans know a lot about what needs to get done to prepare. But climate change diverges from these historic risks in one particularly significant aspect, that it's very difficult for people to understand and act on. Climate change will bring ever worsening extremes for the foreseeable future. Global lockdowns to contain the spread of COVID-19 put the brakes on economic activity worldwide. The economic slowdown in turn led to a precipitous 8.8% decline in those worldwide emissions as measured in Mauna Loa just in the first 6 months of 2020. But that downturn in emissions has not proved lasting. Even with many of us staying home around the world, emissions continued to climb. By December, they were up by 2% over 2019. And in 2020, Mauna Loa Observatory detected 418 parts per million, the highest level of carbon dioxide in human history ever measured up to that time, and likely the highest since 3 million years ago, when sea level were 60 feet above those today. And there is no vaccine for climate change. So how can we have a better future? Unfortunately, one does not have to look far to find examples of cascading failures stemming from the emergence of just one catastrophic risk. Take Texas's catastrophic experience with the cold spell. This winter, Texas plunged into darkness and freezing cold. The event caused billions of dollars of personal property and infrastructure damage and also cost people their lives. The loss of power, wastewater treatment, transportation, and healthcare services imposed untold misery on those in Texas and other places in the South. And we are likely to see future disruptions as a result of this cold. Texas petrochemical plants affected by the Arctic blast have struggled to return to full capacity. Now, the cold that Texas experienced was not unprecedented, as some media reports at the time suggested. In 1983, Texas suffered a cold outbreak that was as cold and long-lived as that earlier this year. The harm that Texas experienced stemmed in large part from its decisions not to invest money in preparing its electric grid for cold temperatures. That choice, of course, in hindsight appears stunningly short-sighted, with the estimates of damages ranging as high as $90 billion. If Texas had taken a different course, choosing to invest in risk reduction before disaster strikes, it would have saved both lives and money. We know that every dollar spent on risk reduction can save $6 or more in disaster recovery. And having stronger building codes and standards yields an astonishing $11 for every $1 spent in making a building stronger, according to the National Institute of Building Sciences. This means that all of us should take steps today to reduce the harm that tomorrow will bring. And with climate change, there'll be more extremes that we need to account for. That's the challenging twist. These extremes will get even bigger and sometimes be highly unfamiliar. We just don't have experience with the ferocity or frequency of events that climate change, we believe, will spawn and continue to spawn. And that unfamiliarity leaves us even more unprepared. Of course, we've enjoyed a relatively steady climate for many thousands of years, and where global temperatures and sea level levels have basically remained stable, and human civilization has flourished. But the assumption that the Earth's climate will continue to remain steady can no longer safely guide us. The assumption that the past can guide us to a safe future is no longer a good one. All of our systems were built to withstand the extremes of the past, but they will fail in the face of these greater extremes. We've made many decisions about land use, how close we can build to the river and the coast based on past levels of flooding. We've determined how much power electric grids must be able to generate based on past historical heat or cold events. Just talk to the people in California with the wildfire. We also didn't plan for those. And if our electric grid collapses under extremes, it brings other systems down along with it. This means that going forward, decisions about where and how we build must account for future risks. With climate change, it's what lies ahead that counts. So what can policymakers do? One of the most basic steps is to prompt earlier action. Is to plan. Planning is a universally recognized way to improve disaster response. President Dwight Eisenhower, who led the Allied invasion in Europe during World War II, once observed that planning steeps decision makers in a problem. He admitted that plans themselves might prove useless, since a lot of times in war and otherwise, things don't go according to plan. But planning is essentially for understanding the problem. And right now, the United States has no climate adaptation plan for the nation. We have a model right now where we tend to spend on disasters after the fact, spending most of our funds in the wake of a harm. But this failure to plan, as our watchdog, the Government Accountability Office, just noted this year, leaves us increasingly vulnerable as a nation. And we are becoming an outlier. China unveiled its plan in 2018, Russia in 2019, Canada is creating one. The Netherlands has had a plan since 2007, and they planned for the 1 in 10,000 year flood. Instead, in the United States, we're adding homes at a record clip into areas at greater risks. For example, more than a third of the country's coastal states have added homes in areas prone to flooding since 2009. A similar phenomenon has occurred in the American West, with an explosion of housing built in areas vulnerable to wildfire. None of these homes are built to engineering standards that will guarantee that they are livable after the fire or flood sweep through. This means that Americans are buying and living in homes destined to burn or succumb to flooding, really in the lifetime of the building. Once the nation creates a national adaptation plan, I don't want to underestimate the difficulty of implementing it. And one of the areas that it really highlights this is managed retreat. I do think Dr. Keeling would have viewed what's happening in Del Mar, California with great interest. One of the things I discovered that in addition to all his work, he had found time to serve as chairman of the Citizens Committee, which drafted the general plan for the city of Del Mar, a coastal community in California. It's just north of San Diego. It's San Diego County's smallest city, about 4,400 residents. It's also a really expensive city. The average value of a home in Del Mar is $2.6 million, according to Zillow. But the northern quarter of that city has about 600 homes built on low-lying property right near the beach and right next to a river, and thus it's vulnerable to flooding, those homes. The town faces an imminent threat, and its current seawalls and protections are not expected to be adequate. In 2019, after 4 years of discussion, outreach, and public meetings, the town adopted a sea level rise adaptation plan that calls for replenishing beaches with sand, dredging the river, and maintaining seawalls to combat rising sea levels. The town then submitted the proposal to the California Coastal Commission. Now, the commission oversees development on about 1,100 miles of coastland along California. Its mission is to preserve the state's beaches for future use by all residents. It views long-term planning as essential to preparing for unstoppable sea level rise. The commission reviewed the plan and sent it back to the town, asking for revisions that would address the long-term impacts of sea level rise. Residents saw that as a red flag. They saw it as a requirement to plan for managed retreat. And those words have become somewhat controversial words in the planning arena because they look at how do communities pull back from areas at risk? How do they make wise decisions about not making investments in areas that are destined to flood and burn, but rather making new investments in areas where communities can thrive? But the Del Mar residents thought, we don't want anything to do with this. We don't want any managed retreat. And the town rejected the commission's request, claiming that it was too small and the property values too high for it to conduct any type of retreat. In the words of its mayor, the town wants to defend homes as long as it's possible to do so by maintaining a wide beach. And this standoff, which shows how hard it will be to prepare for climate change impacts, brings me to my last point: the factors that hinder action to prepare for and respond to catastrophic risk, and especially climate risk. Until these barriers to proper risk assessments are overcome, it may be difficult to make headway on the larger issues. There are many factors upon which I could focus, but there are two that I want to mention in particular. The first is a tendency to focus on mitigation of emissions to the exclusion of adaptation issues. And the second is an abiding belief that the past will resemble the future. Now, overlaid all of this is a simple lack of understanding of climate change. And I will just tell you that there are many decision makers that I encounter who are like me, never had any training on climate change, never had any formal education. And those leaders are making decisions now, and I suspect that because they haven't had the opportunities to really explore this issue, they may be underestimating what's at stake. And this was brought home to me by a very recent study by NYU Stern Business School. It found that most board members of Fortune 100 companies lack any background on environmental issues. They analyzed the individual credentials of the boards of directors of Fortune 100 companies, which are the top 100 companies in the United States according to total revenues as of 2019. In all, they looked at the qualifications of 1,188 directors. When it came to two areas of material importance to most companies and investors, climate and water, just 5 board members, not 5%, 5 out of 1,188 had relevant experience with regard to climate and just 2 with regard to water across all of them. And the study concluded that very few sectors and very few companies were adequately prepared at the board level for issues that were already affecting the performance of the companies. It cited as an example one property and casualty insurance company that had experienced $100 billion in damages as a result of extreme weather events, likely worsened by climate change, but that company had no environmental expertise on its board. So this patchwork overlays all of the decision-making, and we have to understand that people working in climate may not have had the opportunities that are offered at the University of Illinois to really immerse yourself and find out what's important with regard to decision-making in climate change. A second, the other challenge that I want to make sure I talk about is that we are continuing to see a great emphasis on mitigation. And I want to just say, I understand. I think mitigation is essential to avoid the very worst of climate change. And that is key to our success. It's essential, and we must find a better way. And I applaud the Biden administration for their efforts to do so. But with temperatures rising, never imagined record-breaking events increasingly strain the systems and the infrastructure upon which people rely. And we need to make sure that adaptation no longer plays second fiddle to mitigation. We need to find better ways to prepare to reduce the damages ahead, as well as help those countries who've had the very least to do with the climate crisis prepare for the impacts that they will suffer. Policymakers have to account for the fact that as a result of the delay between that accumulation that Mauna Loa is measuring and the warming, further heating is locked into our future. And even if we get those emissions to zero, we've got to prepare for these impacts. Which brings me to the other major consideration, cognitive biases that are impeding our decision-making about climate change. After terrorists flew 2 planes into the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11, 2001, the United States immediately embarked on an investigation to determine how such a thing could possibly have happened. One of their major conclusions is that intelligence officers and other leaders suffered a failure of imagination. They simply could not imagine a terrorist attack of that magnitude in the United States. Climate change also suffers for a lack of imagination. First of all, our innate optimism interferes with our belief that this will happen to us. Recent polling by Yale University shows us how it works. 73% of Americans think, yeah, global warming will harm future generations. 66% think it's the world's poor will be harmed. 62% think people in the US will be harmed, but only 49% think people in their own community will be harmed. And when it comes to their own family, the number drops to 46% of Americans. And then when it comes to, do you think climate change will harm you? It drops to 43%. It reminds me of the book Freakonomics, when the author talked about the number of people who promised to remain together until death do us apart, despite the high divorce rate. We're optimists. We don't think this is going to happen. And if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen to us. Another bias that undermines decision-making is availability bias. Humans often assess risk based on recent past experience. If we fight the last war, we build the bridge to accommodate the last flood. And for that, we are going to be highly vulnerable. We assume that the past will resemble the future when we decide how close we're going to build to that river. And that assumption can no longer safely guide us. But right now, our entire economic system teeters atop a backward-looking risk assessment based on these historical trends. Few decision makers, either in the private or public sector, yet account for the changing risk. It turns out it's hard for people to imagine this future that's ahead. And until we can, they will likely fall short. We will likely fall short in addressing climate risk. So with that, I want to say that our failure to appreciate the exponential growth of climate change and its impacts has left us in an increasingly vulnerable state. And with pandemics, the risk of exponential change is also present. It turns out that the human brain likely works against us in this context. It's what that lies ahead that counts with climate change, but everything we've built has rested on looking towards the past. And that's probably one of the most important things I can leave you with. If all of us could internalize the fact that today's 1 in 100 year record-breaking flood will be maybe a 1 in 25 year event, or even a 1 in 10 year event in the not too distant future. And that what used to be the wildfire season has now expanded to stretch across many months and will get longer, bringing ever bigger, hotter fires, we would make different choices. The news about climate change today is not that it's happening, but that it's accelerating. And to prepare, communities must consider these future risks as they make decisions about how and where people should live. This is an all hands on deck problem. We need everyone finding ways to cut harmful greenhouse gas emissions, but also prepare for the further impacts we will suffer for the foreseeable future. Dr. Keeling's work has identified the problem. The question for all of us is, what will we do about it? So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm delighted to have a chance to speak with you, and I look forward to engaging in a conversation and hearing your questions.
Alice, thank you very much. I wish we could just all give you a major
Thank you.
clapping here, but I guess that doesn't work very well with the Zoom. So we're going to open it up to questions, and Jeff said he would help me figure out how to deal with this. I'm going to ask you the first question, though. One of the things that, kind of building on what you've been saying, one of the things that's really been troubling me, and I'm trying to sort out myself, is we know there needs to be a strong interaction between the human elements, in getting to the things you were talking about, vulnerability, adaptive capacity, et cetera, and climate science, the model results, the details of the analyses that can go into the decision making. But I don't know quite how we get the right interactions between climate scientists and those policymakers and industrial leaders, urban leaders, et cetera, to achieve resiliency. How do we really make adaptation happen? And I think it's it's because I'm a nerdy scientist that I have this problem, but I could use your insights.
Sure, very, very important question. And first is we need to know what the risks are. And in some places we can get to that downscale data. We have a problem with our climate models. They're at such a high resolution, and then we have these catastrophe models that have been developed in the insurance industry, and we're trying to make those work so that we can inform. And then we have the issue of prediction of forecasting so that a community can understand what's ahead. And the way I tend to think of what the problem set is from a mayor that I heard, and Don, maybe you heard her say this at the same time. She said it in the White House, a mayor of a small town called Perdido Beach on the Gulf of Mexico. And she's a part-time mayor, but she's got risk of bigger storms, sea level rise, extreme heat, and oil spills. And she said, look, I get it. I get that I have some really big threats ahead, but I'm a part-time mayor. I have no planning staff. I have no one to help me understand and make these decisions. So what am I supposed to do? I mean, a really good question. And we have, you hear about New York City and California doing great adaptation work, but we have 40,000 jurisdictions, actually 89,000 different governmental entities, but 40,000 communities that have to do some adaptation planning for sure. And how are they going to get that? So I think we need to work on the downscaling, the vulnerability, and this is worldwide. By the way, there are huge gaps worldwide in our understanding and our ability to get down to that detail that's needed for planning. But get to that threat assessment. And once we get to that threat assessment, I hope that the federal government could completely flip its paradigm. We should have a cadre of communicators, translators who are taking the latest science, making sure it's getting into these threat assessments, and then explaining to this mayor, here's the array of programs that the federal government has, and here's how you can tap into them, and we will work with you to make sure that you are as safe as possible going forward. Instead, right now we have, I don't know how many tools that the federal government has put out, but good luck figuring out, sorting out which one applies to you. I don't think that there's a lot of hits on those tools, but really hard to figure out how to plan. We don't have an even threat assessment. It's at a very high level, and we really need to have a detailed way that overlays all the risks, and including environmental justice concerns, in one place that communities can plan together around. And then we need to have a customer-friendly government. After Hurricane Sandy, we did do this for a short time where we said, you know what, we're not going to make everyone who wants money come and learn from each of these agencies, how they work, what their paperwork is, all these little tricks about each of these agencies that are supposed to be serving the American public. We're flipping that paradigm. We're going to make the agencies make themselves accessible and be customer-friendly to those who are in need right now. And we need to do exactly the same thing on a long-term basis so that all these communities who need help, federal support for money, for planning, for understanding, have it available easily.
Excellent.
So Alice, I'm going to ask a question from the chat, and then I'm going to ask one for myself. So this is from Mark, who asks, as droughts and crop failures increase over the next 50 years, what is your prediction for numbers of humans who will migrate in order to survive, and where will they likely migrate to?
Well, the numbers are in the tens of millions. I think it was the UN that estimated something like 150 million. I've forgotten the details. It's a lot, many, many millions of people. And one of the challenges is going to be where they're going to go. So they're going to be survival migrants. You hear this term, climate refugees. They're not really refugees under the definition of our laws. Refugees is a separate category. These are survival migrants. And right now, if you look at our southern border, we have a lot of survival migrants trying to enter the United States from the Northern Triangle, from Central America. So they're coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And you'll recall that in this terrible Atlantic hurricane season we had, that area was hit with two back-to-back within a 2-week span of category 4 hurricanes. Whole livelihoods are wiped out. Housing is wiped out. People are desperate. And of course, then they've had an overlay of extreme violence there. Countries have had great difficulty controlling criminal elements. So you see huge numbers of families and children and many young men on the move who are teenagers. Their families say, go north, try to do something. My fear is, and the wargaming shows this, is that we're going to end up securitizing and just saying we want to shut down everywhere. And you saw how difficult it was for Europe to handle just 5 million migrants from Syria, which, by the way, it was a 1,200-year drought in Syria where a lot of young men moved, and then it was destabilizing, many other factors. but then there's this huge migration, a small migration and compared to what we're going to have. So we need to work with the communities where the people are, and we need to have long-term investments to help people stay at home, because otherwise this will grow very unmanageable. But the problem with securitizing is that we also know that criminal and terrorist elements can take advantage of this and still attack our nation from the outside. So what we want is global stability, and we want to have people thrive where they are.
Thanks. I'm going to ask a question. So over the past 6 months, 8 months, I don't know, there's been lots of discussion and concern about pandemic fatigue. And so my question to you is is there an equivalent to climate change? And if so, how do we prevent it or at least reduce its impact?
Well, climate change definitely can challenge mental health. There's no question after these acute events, there's some mental health challenges, but just working on climate change can be trying and can be depressing because you're looking ahead and it seems rather grim. I don't have a good answer for you, but for anyone here who's considering a career in climate change, I would just say that I've had the extraordinary opportunity to work on really fascinating issues, from chasing bad guys who are robbing with briefcases and not guns, and to human trafficking when I was at DHS, to judging every kind of case there is when I was on the Los Angeles Superior Court. But nowhere have I found an issue more challenging, more interesting, compelling, and requiring greater innovation than this. And for me, I find it it sounds perhaps odd to others, but I find a great deal of joy in this work because it has so much purpose and meaning. It matters what we do here. And there's a tremendous opportunity to bring new ideas, new thoughts, find better ways in a way I've never seen in any other field. So I understand that it causes depression and fear to think so deeply about these issues, but it also can bring great satisfaction to think, what can I do? What do I bring to the table to have better outcomes? And for me, honestly, this doesn't feel like work. I've never had that experience, and I've been in this space now a decade. I happily get up and read and study about climate change just because it's so important. It matters, and there's always more to learn. And there's no one, this is really a problem in the law, no one can tell you, like they did when I was a judge, oh, judge, you can't do that. We already tried it. It doesn't work. Nobody's tried it. We don't know if it works. It's a good idea. Let's talk about it. So I just would communicate, there is so much to be done here. I think it's a fabulous place for one to concentrate their career, because climate change is going to affect everything. So why not be a part of figuring out how you can bring value to this discussion and improve and advance the nation's response?
Yeah, I find in my public talks that I've taken to ending with the last slide being about hope, because otherwise I leave everybody totally depressed. And yep, we do have hope, and we need to make that part of what we talk about. We do have another question from Pierce Lynch, and I'll paraphrase this slightly because I don't think they got it quite right. But when you were researching climate change with the DHS, was there a specific prediction, concern about climate change that experts told you about that made you realize just how bad the effects of climate change could be?
Yes. It was the wet bulb temperature. I had never heard of the wet bulb temperature. And then I looked at the overlay of who could be suffering, and that was, wow. Parts of the world could be uninhabitable, particularly many of those parts don't have air conditioning. And what does air conditioning do to add to the climate problem if it's powered by fossil fuels? So, and the wet bulb temperature, and Don and Jeff, please jump in if I bungle this. But basically, it's a temperature where the temperature is so high, the humidity is so high that the human body can't perspire quickly enough to get rid of the heat. And you expire if you're outside for 6 hours or so, or whatever amount of time. And this is very important for places, agriculture, people who work outdoors, and if there's a power failure, and people will die because there's no way to get away from this heat. And we're already hitting some days in some places with that now, and it will only get worse because extreme heat will increase.
Do we have other questions? I don't see any. I don't know if anyone's had their hand up. I haven't seen it. Jeff, do you know of anybody?
I don't see any.
Okay. Okay. We ought to have a student or something ask a question, all right? So, anybody else, real quick?
I have a question.
Sure.
This is Javier. I'm a student graduating this semester in the Department of Atmospheric Science, and I had one question. Is there any like cultural effort to like re-educate the public on this issue? Because it seems like a lot of the controversy on this is caused by misinformation.
Well, I think that's important. I think that re-educating the public is very important. But if I were in charge and if I were President Biden, I would start with re-educating his workforce. That's within his control. And unfortunately, we're going to ask a lot of people within the federal workforce who've had no education on climate change to be making decisions that are deeply affected by climate change. So we need to start there. And then, that our school systems are highly decentralized, but I would hope that we could begin to speak there as well. And I want to say I have a call out for the universities. This is the biggest threat that we've ever faced. It requires all of us to be thinking together. And I think that no university should be graduating anyone who hasn't had some real exposure to climate change. But that's not happening yet. That's not part of the core curricula necessarily.
That is being considered here, by the way.
Well, I applaud that, and I think it should be. There was a study of 2016 of the top 90 universities by U.S. World News and Report ranking, and they looked at the core curricula in those schools, and they determined that it was a less than 20% chance that a student took a single class in climate change before they graduated. I meet with a lot of students all the time, and one of my questions is, and not for this kind of program, but for foreign, if they want to have a career in foreign affairs, or they're studying something else, law. And I ask, have you had one class, just one class that focused on climate change and the threats and what's involved? Typical answer is no. And that frightens me, given how long it takes to kind of understand what's at stake and how quickly these impacts are occurring, and the choices need to be made now that we don't have a workforce that's better prepared. And I can tell you, I don't know about their education system, but in China, and I'm not a fan of autocratic societies, but the estimate is that they're about 10 years ahead of us in understanding and making choices about adaptation and national security and climate change. So we have a delta here that we need to close. And we need to close it quickly so that we have the people who can make the important decisions in every area that are impacted by climate change.
Okay. Mark did ask another question, which is, what is the more important factor in reducing carbon emissions, moving off of fossil fuels or reducing population?
Wow, I'm going to turn to the climate scientist for that.
That's
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah,
I'm happy to be educated.
It's kind of a question we tend to avoid because no one wants to talk about, oh, who's going to demand that who reduces their population, you know?
Right. Right.
So the easy answer is we put all the action into somehow reducing carbon dioxide and methane, et cetera, which could mean moving off of fossil fuels, or it could mean, oh, we continue some use of fossil fuels and then we bury the carbon or whatever we do with it or reuse it. But we have to sort out how we reduce the emissions that go into the atmosphere somehow. And I don't think we can reduce the population, even if we took that action quickly enough to do what needs to be done. We basically have a decade or two before we're going to be past the 2-degree point centigrade that the UN, back in 2012 or so, said, that's when we're going to see really dangerous climate change. Now, I would argue we're already seeing dangerous climate change, but that's a different discussion. So there's another question from Walton Kelly. How about reducing consumption of animal products?
Well, I think that's an important thing to do. We certainly know that from agriculture, including animal husbandry, we've got a lot of emissions. So that has been over time my personal decision once I started learning about this. But I think all of us need to think about that or figure out better ways to capture the emissions. But it's an all hands on deck. It's not just energy. It's not just transportation. It's the building sector. It's the agriculture sector. It's all of these sectors. And just as it's all hands on deck on reducing the emissions, it's all hands on deck on figuring out how those sectors are also impacted by the climate change events. And one of the things that I don't think there's enough focus on, so I think this would be a great area for someone to focus on, is these boomerang effects, as somehow they're sometimes referred, but how mitigation and adaptation can be in a point of collision, and how do we make the best trade-offs for those. So an example of that in adaptation would be, there's a lot of emphasis on desalination, and desalination is essentially taking briny or salty water and getting fresh water out of it. A lot of environmental impacts, but it's also a huge energy suck. And so if that energy is from fossil fuels, we're really adding to the problem. And then on the flip side, as we learn more about solar power production, a wildfire, we've seen in Australia and in California, when we have wildfire, we have a lot of that soot coming down and landing on those panels, dramatically reducing power just at the time we most need it. So we need to think through how these two efforts intersect and can be complementary versus creating failure points as in our planning, because we're not considering that we may have changed environment as we make mitigation or adaptation choices.
Excellent. I think we probably should close it up for today. I wish we could give you a round of applause from everybody. We'll do it in spirit in any case. And thank you so much, Alice. It's so wonderful to see you again. I look forward to the next time I get to talk with you in person and do something over dinner or drink or something and talk about the good old days.
That's right. And the better days ahead. And there will be.
Hopefully better days ahead.
There will be.
And how we're going to solve these issues.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.